At first, the empath doesn't see the narcissist clearly, and that's not a flaw, it's a function of their psychology. Empaths are wired to perceive meaning, potential, and emotional depth. They look beneath behavior, searching for the wound rather than judging the action. In Jungian terms, they are oriented toward wholeness, not accusation. That is why manipulation works on them, for a time. They interpret inconsistency as complexity, cruelty as pain, and control as fear. But this way of seeing has a limit. When the empath reaches that limit, something profound happens. The emotional fog doesn't lift all at once. It clears slowly, like a landscape emerging at dawn. Patterns become visible. Repetition replaces confusion. The empath begins to realize they are not dealing with a wounded soul-seeking growth, but with a fixed structure that feeds on distortion. And once pattern recognition sets in, the dynamic changes permanently. You cannot unsee what you finally understand. This is the moment the narcissist never anticipates. They believe the empath's compassion is endless, that empathy equals blindness. But clarity is not the opposite of empathy, it is its maturation. The empath stops asking, why are they like this? And starts asking, why am I still here? That single question marks the beginning of psychological sovereignty. From that point forward, the narcissist's tactics lose their power. Gaslighting fails when reality is internally anchored. Charm collapses when motives are recognized. Emotional hooks no longer penetrate because the empath is no longer eking validation from someone incapable of giving it. The illusion breaks, and with it, the narcissist's control. And here is the truth worth sitting with. Once clarity arrives, it does not shout. It stands quietly and refuses to move. When you see clearly, you don't need to fight. You simply stop participating. Once clarity takes root, something even more unsettling follows: emotional detachment. Not the coldness of resentment or the drama of anger, but a quiet internal withdrawal. This is where many misunderstand the empath. They assume distance means bitterness, but psychologically it signals integration. The empath is no longer fused with the emotional field of the other. In Jungian terms, the projection has been retrieved. The energy once poured into fixing, explaining, or saving is reclaimed and returned to the self. For the narcissist, this shift is catastrophic. Narcissistic power does not come from strength, it comes from reaction. Admiration, fear, anger, even pleading, all are forms of supply. What destabilizes them is not confrontation, but neutrality. When the empath stops responding emotionally, the familiar levers no longer work. Provocation yields silence, manipulate. Ion meets calm. Drama collapses into irrelevance. This detachment is not indifference to humanity, it is discernment in action. The empath still feels deeply, but no longer on demand, and no longer for those who violate their psychological boundaries. They are no longer available as an emotional regulator for someone who refuses self-reflection. That is why the narcissist often escalates at this stage: more charm, more cruelty, more urgency, because the absence of reaction feels like annihilation. What makes this moment powerful is that it is invisible. There is no announcement, no ultimatum, no need to be understood. The empath simply stops leaking energy. And when that happens, the entire dynamic reorganizes itself. The narcissist is left performing to an empty room, confused by the sode and loss of impact. Here is the reflection worth carrying forward. Anger keeps you tied to what harmed you, but emotional detachment frees you to move on. The moment you stop feeding what drains you is the moment you begin to reclaim your life. There is an uncomfortable truth that rarely gets acknowledged. The empath often knows the narcissist far better than the narcissist knows themselves. This isn't because the empath is strategic or calculating, but because deep listening is second nature to them. They notice shifts in tone, inconsistencies in stories, moments of defensiveness, and sudden needs for validation. Over time, these observations form a psychological map, one that reveals not just behavior, but insecurity, fear, and unresolved shame. In Jungian terms, the empath has been allowed, ed into the narcissist's shadow, not intentionally but inevitably. Narcissists reveal themselves in fragments, through confessions disguised as jokes, through rage that slips past the mask, through stories where they unintentionally admit their deepest wounds. The empath absorbs this information without weaponizing it. They understand it, contextualize it, and often excuse it. And that is precisely why this knowledge becomes dangerous. Once the empath changes, when the empath reaches emotional independence, they carry this awareness with them, but they no longer need to use it. This is where true power emerges. The narcissist expects retaliation, exposure, or psychological counterattack, but the empath chooses restraint. Silence becomes a boundary, not a weakness. The decision not to strike is not moral superiority, it is self-respect. The empath understands that engaging the narcissist's vulnerabilities would only keep the bond alive. What unsettles the narcissist most is this unspoken asymmetry. They sense they are seen fully and accurately, yet nothing is done with that knowledge. No threats, no leverage, no humiliation, just distance. This creates a quiet terror because narcissi, stick control depends on secrecy and confusion. To be known without being pursued is destabilizing. Here is the insight to sit with. Real dominance is not the ability to harm, but the discipline to walk away holding the truth and refusing to use it. When you choose peace over power plays, you end the cycle, and that is the move that changes everything. After emotional detachment comes something Eve, more threatening to the narcissistic structure, healing. Not surface-level positivity or forced forgiveness, but genuine psychological integration. This is the point where the empath no longer operates from guilt, fear of abandonment, or the need to be chosen. In Jungian terms, the wounded inner child is no longer running the system. The self is now oriented around inner authority rather than external approval. For the narcissist, this creates an immediate crisis. Their tactics rely on predictable emotional reflexes, guilt triggers, intermittent affection, subtle devaluation, and the promise of future change. But healing rewires perception. When love bombing appears, the empath recognizes it as anxiety, not affection. When blame is projected, it is seen as avoidance, not truth. Gaslighting. NG collapses because reality is now internally referenced, not negotiated. This is why narcissists often describe healed empaths as cold, changed, or unrecognizable. What they are actually responding to is the loss of access. Boundaries are no longer debated or justified, they simply exist. The empath no longer explains themselves to someone committed to misunderstanding them. That refusal alone dismantles the narcissist's sense of control. What's important to understand is that healing doesn't turn the empath into the narcissist's opposite. It turns them into themselves. Compassion remains, but it is no longer self-sacrificial. Kindness remains, but it is no longer unconditional. The empath has learned a critical psychological truth. Empathy without boundaries is self-betrayal. At this stage, the narcissist may escalate, retreat, or attempt a dramatic return. None of it matters. The dynamic has already ended internally. And once the bond is broken on, the inside, no external manipulation can revive it. Here is the reflection worth acting on. When you heal, you don't become harder, you become clearer. And clarity is something manipulation cannot survive. What ultimately transforms the empath is not detachment alone, nor healing in isolation, but the integration of what Carl Jung called the shadow. For much of their life, the empath has disowned qualities associated with power, anger, firmness, the capacity to say no without explanation. These traits were not absent. They were suppressed in the name of harmony, morality, or being the good one. But repression does not eliminate the shadow. It merely leaves it unconscious and easily exploited. When the empath reaches this stage, something profound shifts. They no longer fear their own intensity. They allow themselves to feel anger without becoming cruel, to assert boundaries without guilt, to withdraw without apology. This is not a loss of kindness, it is the maturation of it. Jung was clear on this point. True morality is not innocence, but conscious choice. The healed empath can now choose restraint because they are capable of force. To the narcissist, this version of the empath is deeply unsettling. The old dynamic relied on the empath's predictability, their reluctance to confront, their fear of being seen as harsh, their habit of over-explaining. But an integrated empath is no longer readable in that way. They are calm, but not passive, compassionate, but not compliant. Their presence carries weight because it is rooted in self-respect. This is why the narcissist often senses danger without being able to name it. They feel exposed, as though the empath can see through the performance, yet has no need to respond. Power has shifted internally, not theatrically. It's no dominance display, no moral lecture, just grounded certainty. Reflection to take with you is this: when you reclaim your shadow, you don't become darker, you become whole. And wholeness is something manipulation can neither imitate nor control. At the final stage, the empath does something the narcissist never truly prepares for. They leave, quietly, cleanly, and without spectacle. No drama. Tick confrontation, no demand for accountability, no attempt to be understood. From the outside, it may look uneventful. Psychologically, it is devastating. Narcissistic identity is sustained through engagement. Conflict still provides relevance. Silence does not. This departure is not avoidance, it is resolution. By this point, the empath has already disengaged internally. The conversations have ended in the mind long before they end in real life. There is no need for closure because clarity has already provided it. In Jungian terms, the complex has been dissolved. The emotional charge that once animated the dynamic is gone, and without that energy, the relationship cannot survive. What unsettles the narcissist most is the absence of reaction. No anger to feed on, no sadness to manipulate, no longing to exploit. The empath's silence becomes a mirror, reflecting back the emptiness the narcissist has spent a lifetime trying to avoid. This is why narcissists often attempt a sudden return at this stage: apologies, nostalgia, promises of change. Not because transformation has occurred, but because the loss of supply feels like psychological freefall. For the empath, walking away is not about punishment, it is about alignment. Staying would require a return to self-betrayal. Leaving is an act of integrity. It marks the moment the empath chooses truth over attachment, peace over repetition, self-respect over hope for someone else's awaken. The final thought to carry with you is this: sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is not what you say, but what you no longer participate in. When you walk away whole, the cycle ends, and your life finally begins.